Hey, welcome to On 3. Typically when I build a shelter, I'd look for something that's already been made by nature that saves you lots of time and lots of effort. Something like this down tree right here that's still solidly supported and it's not going to go anywhere would be a fantastic place to start building. Kind of just clear off the area and then start laying in your logs to build your structure and to waterproof it and get it a little bit more insulated. When you're in certain areas, what I like to do is try to mimic and build shelters the way that the natives would do. In this area, we are in South Dakota, and the Lakota Indians would build teepees here. But you need, for a teepee, you need long poles, obviously, and then you need some sort of covering, which they use animal hides, buffalo hides, which I don't have access to. A more modern version of that would be like a tarp, but I don't have that either. So what I'm going to probably end up doing is doing more of a lean-to type shelter. So anytime you're building a shelter out of natural materials, it's always a good idea to kind of utilize existing structures, so it saves you lots of work. If you've ever built a natural structure, it takes a ton of effort, lots of time. So if you can utilize what you have here already, like these walls of rock around me, I'm already kind of envisioning what I'm going to build. I've got a wall here, I've got a wall here, kind of a wall behind me, and then maybe I could build a fire right here in this corner, and then these rocks will reflect any heat back, and I'll close in everything except maybe this one opening right here in front of me, and I'll be nice and snug and protected from any elements that will happen. Thunderstorms in this area in the evenings are super common, and this would probably be a pretty good spot to keep me out of those elements. Yeah, that's good. We'll just keep working it. So another key thing to remember, if you do have a tool like this and you're out in the wild and you actually need this tool, it's important to remember not to lay it down just anywhere, because if I lay this thing down, this brown rusty tool, it blends into the environment really well and I can lose it easy. So I need to keep close watch on this thing and kind of keep it in my hand the entire time. Keep the sheath on it when you're moving around so you don't accidentally cut yourself. I've cut myself pretty bad with an axe before, and it's not something you want to do if you don't have immediate medical attention nearby. So shelters can be built without tools as well. You don't necessarily need a tool to do the job. The best way to break branches, break logs, ideally you're going to use down and dead stuff because it's going to be easier to snap, it's drier. You can break them between two trees that are relatively close together. Just slide it in there. Put the spot that you want it to break on, the length that you want your piece of wood, right on the tree that's closest to you. You can pull on the logs, you can do that, but if I do it this way, and I pull on this log, and this was a sturdier log than this, if I pulled on it and it snapped suddenly, it might come back and whack me. So the safest and easiest way to do it is just kind of put it on your hips like this, put it low on the hips, and just walk until it snaps. And that's a real precise break, exactly where I wanted it to break, and that's the length that I need. I'm still kind of in the preliminary planning stages of this shelter. I'm working out the framework and exactly where I want everything to go. And as I'm building, I'm kind of planning it out and thinking it through. One thing that I see that I mentioned earlier is that there might be some water running down this little crack here in the rocks. And that's not a huge deal unless you're laying directly on the ground. If you're laying directly on the ground, you're going to get soaked. So what I would do here is I'm going to dig a small little trench right here in the middle of my shelter, and I'm going to build my bed over top of it. And any water that comes down through this crack in the rocks will shed through here, and I'm going to save all this pine straw here for my bedding as long as it's dry. So I'm going to dig a small trench right here so it has a place to go and easily escape out. Water's just going to travel the path of least resistance. So if I dig my trench here with my stick and then build my bed over top of it without anything touching it really, this low part of the trench, the water will have an easy way out and not get me wet. So the bed's coming along. You can see I've laid logs across the trench that I dug, and nothing's going to impede the water still, so the water can still run down through this crack. Not that it's going to be a gully washer. It doesn't appear to be any evidence of a river running through here or anything, but just in case some water should trickle through, that gully is left open, that little trench is left open, and all of my logs that I'll be laying on top of will allow that water to flow through and it won't get me wet. I'm building the structure really small and compact, so if it gets cold, it'll keep in some of my body heat. And I'm planning on building a fire right here. I'm gonna move all this pine straw, obviously, but I'm gonna build a fire right here so smoke can escape out the front of the structure, a small fire, and that'll help heat me up as well. I gotta finish building up here. This is kind of where my head's gonna go. Where my head's gonna go right there, and I can stay kind of curled up in this little shelter here and stay out of the elements and hopefully keep me relatively dry. Now, it won't be waterproof, but it'll be water resistant, and it'll keep most of the rain off of me. This will protect me. This big rock wall is fantastic, keep a lot of wind and rain off. This rock wall will keep a lot of wind and rain off, and then my really steep pitched roof will help shed a lot of the water if it does come in from this direction. So I have the basic framework of my structure complete. There's the rafters essentially of the house. There's the foundation of the floor or my bedding that's going to keep me insulated away from the cold ground, wet ground, and my little channel or ditch that I dug underneath so any water can shed out of there without getting me wet. Fireplace is there where my axe is. I saved those dry pine needles, and I'm going to pile it up on top of those pieces of wood there, because that's extremely uncomfortable to lay down on, and something that's a little bit uncomfortable when you first lay down is extremely uncomfortable around midnight. So instead of clearing off all of my branches or limbing all of my branches that I use for my structure away from my shelter, I drug the entire branch over here and then cleared off or limbed all of the branches here. So now I can use this stuff here to pile all on top of my shelter. So now what I'm doing in an attempt to waterproof this shelter or water resist this shelter is lay all these pine boughs on top of it, starting at the bottom and kind of working my way up just like you would with shingles. And in theory, if I point most of these pine needles facing downhill, any water that hits it will run off of one onto the next, onto the next, and onto the next, and eventually make it down to the bottom of my shelter without getting inside. And that's the theory. It won't be perfectly waterproof, but if I can get this thick enough and lay the pine needles in a downward direction, it should be fairly watertight. Now when I get inside, what I can do is get inside, lay down in my shelter how I would be sleeping, and kind of look up and see where there's any daylight or where any issues might be, where some rain might trickle its way down on my forehead in the middle of the night. What I can do is get inside, lay down in my shelter how I would be sleeping, and kind of look up and see where there's any daylight or where any issues might be, where some rain might trickle its way down on my forehead in the middle of the night and freeze me to death. And just a little drip of water can make a big difference. Just a tiny drip of water can really soak you. So as best you can, get it completely shut off and completely dark where you can't see through. I'm gonna leave a small hole right here. I'm gonna leave a small hole right here so it can ventilate. So when I make a fire behind the camera there, that hopefully it doesn't completely smoke me out and just make a smokehouse, and it'll draft a little bit better. If it was gonna be really cold tonight, I'd probably shut that in a little bit more, but it's not gonna be freezing cold, so I think this will be sufficient. Go ahead. So the ground is pretty wet from raining yesterday, but where the sun is shining, these bright spots on the ground, the pine straw that's on the very top is relatively dry or drier. So that's what I'm trying to gather. I'm just taking the top inch of pine straw off the top and kind of raking that into a pile with my fingers and collecting that up. And after I do this a few thousand times, I'll have enough bedding. So I'm just gathering some rocks now to build a fire ring in my shelter to keep the hot coals and stuff from spreading to basically the big giant tinder bundle that I've created as my home. So gathering some rocks, piling them around in a circle. Real simple, doesn't have to be pretty. It just needs to get the job done. I don't want to build it up too high here, obviously, because then it'll block the heat going in towards me. But I want to keep it off of this dry pine straw that I'm going to be sleeping on. So I'll build it up just a little bit. And then all these walls here will kind of reflect a lot of that heat back in towards me too. So just to protect myself a little bit, I'm gonna... Ah, yes! Pine resin's catching up. All the sticks are catching on fire. I think we're out of the woods. Well, not literally, we're still in the woods, but the fire's going. My hands, look at this. The pine pitch worked for sure, but that's not coming off. You gotta wear that off. But it did save my hands a little bit. They were getting really beat up. You can see me still shaking from the effort. But I've got a fire. I just gotta make sure the flames don't get too high in here. If I keep my flames nice and low, get my axe out of the way so it doesn't catch on fire. Keep my flames relatively low, let that pine pitch burn and keep it consistently going. And then I can stack up some firewood here and just feed it throughout the night. I can stay relatively warm, relatively dry, and comfortable. And the fire is just a huge, big boost, you know. That's probably the hardest hand drill fire I've ever done. It took me forever. I don't know how many attempts that was, but it was a lot. So I got to keep my fire kind of low, smash it down a little bit, keep it from getting too high so I don't catch my giant, big, tender bundle of a house on fire. So we're going to climb into my humble abode. Tight squeeze, which is good because a small house is easy to cool and heat. A big shelter is a waste of energy, it's a waste of resources, and it's a waste of time. A small shelter just big enough for me to sit up like this in, do small little tasks, you know, in front of the fire and stay warm and dry if the weather was bad. Lay down long enough for me to lay down completely without something dangling out to get wet and then have my pants or something wick water up my legs. We don't want any of that. Now, if it was really, really cold, I could close it in completely and really wrap myself up, except for maybe a small little breather hole on each side so my fire can draft. And then just my body heat, if it was really, really closed in and really, really well insulated, my body heat could generate enough heat in here, and that shelter, if it was dense enough, could trap that heat in there to keep me just a little bit warmer and a little bit drier. So this position on my fire is working really good. I'm kind of on an uphill slope here, which is cool because the heat is just flowing up through my shelter and it's drafting really well. The smoke is going up out the front and drafting up through this hole that I left in the top. So I'm glad that I left this portion open. But it's really warm and cozy in here. So if it was to get really cold tonight, you know, freezing temperatures, if it might get down to, might get 40s, 30s, something like that. If it was to get that cold, this would be awesome just to keep this fire stoked in a little bit each time. Wait, sleep about 20 minutes till it goes out, blow it back to life. Just make sure I have lots of little kindling and stuff to keep it going all night long. If it came a torrential downpour, I think I'd be okay. This fire would keep me warm and help dry out anything that should happen get wet. I could hang my clothes up here or something, wrap it around some of these sticks, hang my socks up to dry them out.